Hello and welcome to my channel, Vice Rhino here. Today I'm finishing off my Easter Bible reading with the trial before Pilate and the Crucifixion story. It's another long-ass one, so let's get right into it. Okay, so we're going to start this section off a little bit different. So far I've been reading the Gospels in the order they were probably written in, but there's a section in Matthew that isn't in the other three, but they do cover it in Acts, which was probably written by the same author as Luke, so I'm going to read this part of the story first in Matthew, then in Acts. So this is Matthew chapter 27. Judas hangs himself. Early in the morning, all the chief priests and the elders of the people came to the decision to put Jesus to death. They bound him, led him away, and hastened him over to Pilate, the governor. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse, and returned the 30 silver coins to the chief priests and the elders. "I have sinned," he said, "for I have betrayed innocent blood." "What is that to us?" they replied. "That's your responsibility." So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. The chief priest picked up the coins and said, "It is against the law to put this into the treasury, since it is blood money." So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. That is why it has been called the Field of Blood to this day. The phrase there, "to this day," is giving a hint that Matthew is not an eyewitness. He's writing years later. So, verse 9. "Then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. They took the 30 silver coins, the price set on him by the people of Israel, and they used them to buy the potter's field as the Lord commanded to me." So in Matthew, Judas very clearly throws the silver coins back into the temple with the chief priests and hanged himself. And then after Judas hanged himself, the priests bought a potter's field. So that's how it goes in Matthew. So let's take a look at how it is in Acts now. So now we're on to Acts, which is authored by the same person as Luke. The story of Judas' death in Acts is chapter 1, verses 15 through 19. "In those days Peter stood up among the believers, a group numbering about 120, and said, 'Brothers, the scripture had to be fulfilled which the Holy Spirit spoke long ago through the mouth of David concerning Judas, who served as a guide for those who arrested Jesus. He was one of our number and shared in this ministry.' Verse 18, "With the reward he got for his wickedness, Judas bought a field. There he fell headlong, his body burst open, and all his intestines spilled out. Everyone in Jerusalem heard about this, so they called that field in their language Akeldama, that is, the field of blood." So, in this version of the story, Judas bought the field himself, whereas in the other version, the chief priest bought the field. And also in the other version, it didn't mention what field Judas hanged himself in. It didn't say anything about it being the potter's field. It was just Judas went off and hanged himself, and then the chief priest bought the potter's field for a place to bury foreigners. Judas did not hang himself in that field. He just hanged himself somewhere. It doesn't matter where he hanged himself in that story. Now, in this story, Judas buys the field, and then he falls in it, and his body burst open and all his intestines spilled out. That does not sound like a hanging to me. Sounds like he tripped and fell on some rocks or something. That must have been pretty sharp rocks. That doesn't even sound like a realistic way to die. Like, when do you fall over and have your intestines fall out? Now I know the apologetic for this is that he hanged himself in the potter's field, and then, after hanging there for a few days, his swollen, decomposing corpse fell out of the tree, and that's when his intestines burst open. But here we can apply Occam's razor, and the hypothesis that requires the fewest assumptions is probably the true one. So if we look at the two of them, you have to assume that in Acts he just ignored the whole hanged himself and hung there for a few days, and his dead body had all his intestines spill out. Also, he fell headlong. If you hang yourself, your head is right way up. Headlong is head first, so he's falling down head first in Acts. So if his body was just suspended from a tree or something, and then his body fell down, that's also requiring the body be somehow flip around so that his head is pointing down. So it just, I don't know. I could see how you could reconcile that with a lot of cognitive dissonance and mental gymnastics, but a plain reading of it doesn't fit. So now on to Jesus' trial before Pilate, starting with Mark. So, Mark chapter 15, Jesus before Pilate. Very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin reached a decision. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Now, remember, this is the whole Sanhedrin. I brought that up last time. In this video, this is where it's going to come back to haunt the authors. But also, very early in the morning, the Sanhedrin was not allowed to convene before the morning sacrifice. So that's That goes back to them not having trials at night and the rules that I showed in the last video. Also, why would they bring him to Pilate? If they reached a decision, if they found him guilty of blasphemy, the punishment was stoning. So they would have just taken him and stoned him to death. So verse 2, "Are you king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "Yes, it is as you say," Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things, so again Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they're accusing you of." So he already answered, and now he's asking him, "Aren't you going to answer?" So again, this looks like them trying to have their silence and also have him condemn himself with his words, because there's really nothing else to condemn him. But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Now it was the custom at the feast to release a prisoner whom the people requested. There is no such custom recorded anywhere except for in the Bible. The other historians that recorded some of Pilate's actions, like Josephus and Philo of Alexandria, they made it quite clear that Pilate was a very ruthless governor. In fact, the reason he was removed from governorship is because he finally went too far in the emperor's eyes. He was a tyrant. He had no problem killing innocent people. There were instances of times when people would gather in a revolutionary sense, and he would have soldiers in the crowd that when he gave the signal, they would just kill people willy-nilly. Innocent, revolutionary, doesn't matter, they'll just kill him. Pilate was not a nice guy. He would not be releasing prisoners. Even if there was a custom like that, he would probably just say no. Verse 7, "A man called Barabbas was imprisoned with the insurrectionist who had committed murder in the uprising." So again, this guy is insurrectionist. He's a rebel against Rome. There is no chance Pilate would release this guy. Also an interesting point, Barabbas, it's derived from Aramaic bar Abba, which literally means son of the father. So if we're looking at this from Mark being literary allegory, we have two sons of the Father here. There's Barabbas and Jesus, and both of them are named as the Son of the Father. So there's Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah, and then there's Barabbas, the Son of the Father. This parallels the scapegoat ritual that's laid out in Leviticus, in which there would be two goats, and one of them will be heaped upon with the burdens of all the sins of the people, and would be driven away, sent out into the desert, set free, basically, and the other one would be sacrificed to the Lord. So this is a very close parallel to that. So you have Barabbas, the son of the father, who is a murderer and a revolutionary, he's a sinner, is set free and released to the wild, whereas the other goat, the perfect, pure, stainless, sinless one, is a sacrifice for the Father. So this, again, as literary allegory, this makes perfect sense, but taken literally, it makes no sense, because no such custom existed. So verse 8, "The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. 'Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?' asked Pilate, knowing it was out of envy that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead." Now this is the same crowd that welcomed Jesus with open arms just a few days before into Jerusalem and were super excited to see him. How did they stir up the crowd? And why did they need to arrest him in secret if they could easily stir up the crowd against him? "What shall I do then with the one you call king of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him," they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him!" Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. That is just completely out of character for Pilate. He did not have any respect for the Jews or the Jewish council, there's no way he would just cave into their demands like this. So that's the Jesus before Pilate section of Mark. Now it's time to move on to Luke. All right, so Luke chapter 23. "Then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, 'We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Christ, a king.' So Pilate asked Jesus, 'Are you king of the Jews?' 'Yes, it is as you say,' Jesus replied." So here they're giving Pilate more of an actual reason to condemn him. In Mark, it was just more of a, here's Jesus, he says he's king of the Jews, now crucify him, we demand it. And Pilate listened. But here they're actually providing some substance that Pilate could actually use to form some sort of judgment against him. "Then Pilate announced to the chief priests and the crowd, 'I find no basis for a charge against this man.' But they insisted, 'He stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and has come all the way here.' On hearing this, Pilate asked if the man was a Galilean. When he learned that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased, because for a long time he had been wanting to see him. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform some miracle. He plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and teachers of the law were standing there, vehemently accusing him. Then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him. Dressing him in an elegant robe, they sent him back to Pilate. That day Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they had been enemies. This is the only record that we have suggesting that Pilate and Herod were ever friends. They detested each other, from my understanding. Also, there was no Herod in Mark. They all convinced Pilate to crucify him, so in this one, Pilate's trying to pass the buck, so he sends him off to Herod, and then Herod just sends him back. And he dressed him in a fancy robe before he sent him back, so that's that might come into play later. When the soldiers beat him, they put him in a purple robe. Purple was one of the most expensive dyes at the time, which is why it was associated with royalty. So this might be explaining where they would have gotten the purple robe from, because just common soldiers probably didn't have the money to just have a purple robe lying around to put on some guy that's probably bleeding and, ruining the robe. Anywho, on to verse 13. Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence, and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore I will punish him, and then release him." With one voice they cried out, "Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us!" Barabbas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. So with one voice, they all cried out at the same time. That paints a goofy picture.
You're all different! Yes, we are all different! I'm not.
So again, that seems more like a literary device. Did they have a script beforehand? I mean, it's hard to say something at the same time as someone on purpose. So to just have everybody, not just like 2 or 3 people, but everybody at the same time say the exact same thing, it's a goofy picture. And also, we have Barabbas again. This isn't saying that there was a custom for it. They're just demanding that Barabbas be released. So it looks like Luke knew there was no custom for it and was correcting Mark's error, but the story had to stay because, the scapegoat metaphor works pretty well. So they're demanding that they release Barabbas. Verse 20, wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" For the 3rd time he spoke to them. "Why? What crime has this man committed? I have found him in no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore I will have him punished and then release him." But with loud shouts they insistently demanded that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed, so Pilate decided to grant their demand. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, the one they asked for, and surrendered Jesus to their will. Why is he letting this crowd push him around? This guy was ruthless. All the other historical accounts have him being a ruthless dictator, but he's just, the crowd shouted it loudly, so I'm going to do what the crowd says. That makes no sense. Why would he release an insurrectionist and a murderer just because a bunch of people yelled for it? That's not the way any judicial system has ever worked. But on to Matthew. Let's see what he has to say about it. All right, so Matthew's account of Jesus before Pilate starts in chapter 27, verse 11. Meanwhile, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Yes, it is as you say," Jesus replied. When he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate asked him, "Don't you hear the testimony they are bringing against you?" But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Now it was the governor's custom at the feast to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd, so the custom's back now. Verse 16, at the time they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas, so when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, "Which one do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Christ?" For he knew it was out of envy that they had handed Jesus over to him. When Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message, "Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." So it looks here like they realized that Pilate, as he was known, would not have released anybody just because a bunch of people yelled at him. So they're giving him some extra motivation here by having his wife be the person who tells him, "You got to release this guy, don't have anything to do with him." So that's why he's trying to release him, as opposed to, "Oh, the Jews are being loud, maybe I should do what they say to shut them up a little," because that just wouldn't have worked with Pilate. So this is Matthew filling one of Mark's plot holes. Verse 20, but the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" asked the governor. "Barabbas," they answered. "What shall I do then with Jesus who is called the Christ?" Pilate asked. They all answered, "Crucify him." Why? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, Crucify him! When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. I am innocent of this man's blood, he said. It is your responsibility. All the people answered, Let his blood be on us and on our children. That doesn't sound like something people would actually say just before an execution. This sounds more like Matthew's writing to a Gentile audience, and he knows that they're not too fond of the Jews, so he's throwing in some nice, healthy anti-Semiticism there. Who would say that? Who would, at an execution of some innocent guy, would just be like, oh yeah, his blood's going to be on my head and on my children's head. Then he released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. So yeah, there we have the scapegoat being released again, and the sacrifice being handed over to be a sacrifice. So now on to John. So John's story of Jesus with Pilate starts in chapter 18, verse 28. Then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the place of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanliness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, What charges are you bringing against this man? Oh, so they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. They have not yet eaten the Passover. The other three Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, the Passover is done. The Passover is not done, but the Passover meal has already been eaten, and that was the Last Supper. So Pilate came out to them and asked, What charges are you bringing against this man? If he were not a criminal, they replied, we would not have handed him over to you. Pilate said, Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. But we have no right to execute anyone, the Jews objected. So that's an insertion to make sense of the fact that they didn't just find him guilty of blasphemy and execute them themselves, and it's also a lie, because they absolutely were allowed to execute people that broke religious laws. They were not allowed to execute people that broke civil laws. So if he was a revolutionary, they would have had to take him to Pilate, but they accused him of blasphemy. Blasphemy absolutely fell under their jurisdiction. They would have had no problem executing him. This happened so that the words Jesus had spoken indicating the kind of death he was going to die would be fulfilled, because John knew that if the Jews executed him, it would be by stoning, and the prophecy said he was going to be crucified. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus and asked him, Are you the king of the Jews? So now he's back inside the palace. All the Jews and everybody's outside. Who is witnessing this conversation? Who is John's source for this? We have no idea. So as far as we know, John's just making shit up. Is that your own idea, Jesus asked, or did others talk to you about me? Am I a Jew? Pilate replied. It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What is it you have done? Jesus said, My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews, but now my kingdom is from another place. You are a king then, said Pilate. Jesus answered, You are right in saying I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. Again, we have John's badass Jesus, taking no flack from anyone. What is truth? Pilate asked. With this, he went out again to the Jews and said, I find no basis for a charge against him. I don't think Pilate would have been playing the back and forth. It would have been either come into the courtyard and watch the trial yourself, or stay out here and I'm not coming back out to consult you. Like, he's not going to be running back and forth to consult with the Jews that he had no problem brutally murdering in other situations. Verse 39. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews? They shouted back, No, not him. Give us Barabbas. Now Barabbas had taken part in a rebellion. Chapter 19. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! And they struck him on the face. That's in a different section after Pilate gives the sentence in the other books. So I will get to that with Matthew, Mark, and Luke in just a moment. Verse 4, Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews, Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him. When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, Here is the man. As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, Crucify, crucify! But Pilate answered, You take him and crucify him, but as for me, I find no basis for a charge against him. Again, this is totally out of character for Pilate. He was not a nice guy. The Jews insisted... It's making me feel anti-Semitic just reading this. All this, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews. So, I'm not actually anti-Semitic. I'm just reading the Bible. Sorry, that's what it says. The Jews insisted, We have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God. When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. Why would he be afraid? And he went back inside to the palace. Where do you come from? He asked Jesus, but Jesus gave him no answer. Oh, I see. He's afraid because he thinks he might be the son of a god that Pilate doesn't believe in. Makes perfect sense. See stuff like that all the time in religious texts with people that don't believe in your god suddenly being afraid just because you said something about your god being more powerful or something. Where do you come from? He asked Jesus, but Jesus gave him no answer. Do you refuse to speak to me? Pilate said. Don't you realize I have the power to either free you or to crucify you? Jesus answered, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. Yeah, you know, the one that God dictated in advance would be the one handing him over to him. That's the one. He had no choice in the matter, but he's guilty of the greater sin. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, if you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. There's no way this would have gone this far. Pilate would have either just killed him or said, fuck that, and let him go. When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of the preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. So this is the day of preparation for the Passover. Here is your king, Pilate said to the Jews, but they shouted, take him away, crucify him. Shall I crucify your king? Pilate asked. We have no king but Caesar, the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. This is just completely out of character for Pilate. And, well, completely out of character for any Roman governor. Like, anyone who Rome would place over a rebellious province like Judea was at this time would not be this guy who can easily be swayed by just a crowd of people outside his palace yelling at him. Like, it's just, even if we didn't have any other sources for Pilate, it makes no sense that Pilate would have behaved in this manner. Anyhow, time to go back to Mark. Okay, so we're back to Mark, and the order's getting a little wonky because they have it in different orders in different Gospels. So in Mark, there's a section called The Soldiers Mock Jesus. We've already read that part in John. So in Mark chapter 15, verse 16, the soldiers mocked Jesus. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together a whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, Hail, King of the Jews! Again and again they struck him on the head with the staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him, and when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. And again, that comes back to, like, purple robes. Like, purple was one of the most expensive dyes. I think blue was up there with it. But purple was a really expensive dye. They would not have just had some purple robe sitting around ready to dress up a prisoner with. Especially, like, even if one of them had a purple robe of some kind, they wouldn't put it on a guy who's bleeding, and they wouldn't beat him up in it, because they're probably going to ruin this expensive purple robe. So it makes no sense that they would have dressed him up like that. So in Luke, he kind of fixed that plot hole by having him sent to Herod, and Herod, as part of mocking him, put him in the purple robe. So Luke has the guards mock Jesus just before the trial. It says, the men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded, prophesy who hit you. And they said many other insulting things to him. That was actually, I covered that in the Gethsemane section, because that was something that, depending on which version you were in, it was either the guards or it was the high priests themselves, or like it changed who was doing that to him. But it had to have a guards mock Jesus section. But in Luke, it put the purple robe under Herod, so it could fix the plot hole of where did they get the purple robe from and why were they so careless with this really, really expensive robe. So I'm going to skip Luke because we've already read that. It's his trial with Herod, which is not found anywhere else. All right, so Matthew's account of the soldiers mocking Jesus is pretty much identical to Mark's. Governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him, put a scarlet robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand and knelt in front of him and mocked him. Hail, King of the Jews, they said. They spit on him and took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. After they had mocked him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him. So again, where'd they get this robe of expensive color? It's a different color than the other ones, but not very much of a different color. I mean, scarlet and purple aren't that far apart, I suppose. I'll let that contradiction slide, but aside from that, it's pretty much the same as in Mark. Okay, so now we're on to the crucifixion. So it's time to get to the meat of the story. Mark chapter 15, verse 21. The crucifixion. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. The idea of forcing someone else to carry the cross, that would be unheard of with a Roman crucifixion. They made the prisoners carry their own crosses, because that'd be like Like they'd be punishing an innocent bystander for a crime he didn't commit. That would be looked upon as him taking some of the punishment for Jesus. There's no reason for him to be carrying it. Again, this is one of the parts that points to Mark being completely literary allegory. So, verse 22, they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him, dividing up his clothes, and they cast lots to see what each would get. It was the 3rd hour when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 robbers with him, one on the right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days? Come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. "He saved others," they said, "but he cannot save himself. Let this Christ, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see him and believe." Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. So everybody's mocking Jesus while he's hanging on the cross, including the other 2 guys that are hanging on the crosses beside him. Okay, so Luke's account of the crucifixion starts in chapter 23, verse 26. As they led him away, they seized Simon from Cyrene, who was on his way in from the country, and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. Again, Simon from Cyrene, that doesn't make any sense, but it doesn't give his children in this one. A large number of people followed him, including women who were mourning and wailing for him, which is quite a contrast from Mark. In Mark, everybody was hurling insults at him. There was nobody on his side. Jesus turned and said to them, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, weep for yourselves and for your children, for the time will come when you say, 'Blessed are the barren women, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will say to us, 'O mountains, fall on us, and to the hills cover us.' For if the men do these things when the tree is green, what happens when it is dry?" So in the middle of him being led out to be crucified, he turns around and gives a sermon. I don't think the guards would have allowed that. 2 other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, there they crucified him along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Christ of God, the chosen one." The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, "If you are king of the Jews, save yourself." There was a written notice above him which read, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. "Aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him. "Don't you fear God," he said, "since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." That's quite an eloquent little speech for a common criminal that was sentenced to crucifixion. Jesus answered him, "I tell you the truth, today you will be with me in paradise." So in Mark's version, it has both the people who were crucified with him hurling insults at him, and then Luke decided to put in this nice little story of him redeeming the guy on the cross, who is a very eloquent speaker, despite being a self-admitted petty criminal. But anyway, on to Matthew. All right, so Matthew's crucifixion is in chapter 27, verse 32. As they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross. They came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. There they offered Jesus wine to drink mixed with gall, but after tasting it, he refused to drink it. When they had crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots. Superscript B. A few late manuscripts say lots, that the word spoken by the prophet might be fulfilled. They divided my garments among themselves and cast lots for my clothing. That's quite a large insertion there. So that's again evidence of scribes in later times clearing up what they saw to be errors in the earlier manuscripts. Verse 36. And sitting down, they kept watch over him there. Above his head they placed a written charge against him. "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." In the same way the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders mocked him. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him, for he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" In the same way, the robbers who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him. So again, we're back to both robbers heaping insults on him rather than just one. There's no eloquent speech from the one rebuking the other, and we have a note telling us that scribes were inserting large sentences into the middle of the text. So that's fun. Now it's time to go to John. All right, crucifixion story in John starts in chapter 19, verse 16 and a half. It says, "So the soldiers took charge of Jesus, carrying his own cross," because remember, this is John. Jesus is a badass in John. He doesn't need no help from Simon of Cyrene. He's carrying his own cross. He went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. Here they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on each side, and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. So that's, all 4 Gospels have slightly different variations on the sign. So in Mark, it's just the King of the Jews. Then in Luke, it is, this is the King of the Jews. In Matthew, it says, this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. And then in John, we have Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. So, small quibble, they all essentially say the same thing, but with slightly different variations. Many of the Jews read the sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. The chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be the King of the Jews. Pilate answered, what I have written. See, that's more like Pilate's character. If the Jews tell him to do something, he'll say, screw you, done it this way, that's the way I'm doing it. Tough cookies. When the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, dividing them into 4 shares, one for each of them, with the undergarment remaining. This garment was seamless, woven into one piece from top to bottom. Let's not tear it, they said to one another. Let's decide by lot who will get it. This happened that the scripture might be fulfilled, which said, they divided my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. Hey, that's almost word for word what was inserted into Matthew in some of the later manuscripts. So I think they were trying to plug some plot holes again. So this is what the soldiers did. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, Dear woman, here is your son, and to the disciple, Here is your mother. From that time on, this disciple took her into his home. So even while he's hanging on the cross, this is badass Jesus. He's given orders to the people that are watching him be crucified. It's like, behold your son, I'm dying. You, that's your mother now. So basically he's ordering this guy to take his mother into his home as he's being crucified. Like, John's Jesus is ridiculous. It's kind of fun to read, actually. On to the death of Jesus, Mark chapter 15, verse 33. At the 6th hour, darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. Now, remember in John earlier, it said that at the 6th hour, he was still with Pilate. That's when Pilate sentenced him to be crucified. So in Mark, at the 6th hour, he's already up on the cross, about to die. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, I think, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Interesting that God can forsake himself, so that's an interesting power that God has, the ability to just, not be there with himself. When some of those standing near heard this, they said, Listen, he's calling Elijah. One man ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a stick, and offered it to Jesus to drink. Now leave him alone, let's see if Elijah comes to take him down, he said. So in the Lord's Supper section, chapter 14, verse 25, he said, I tell you the truth, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it anew in the kingdom of God. Now, he's drinking wine vinegar here, so I would assume that wine vinegar, even if it does have vinegar in it. Now, I actually think this is more along the lines of wine that has gone bad. It's wine that's gone sour, but there is wine in it. So there is fruit of the vine in the sponge, and he did drink it. So I guess he lied at the Last Supper? Either that or because it's a slightly different drink, or it's not quite as nice a drink, they consider it to be different. That's a bit of a minor nitpick, though. Verse 37, with a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. And when the centurion, who stood there in front of Jesus, heard his cry and saw how he died, he said,
Well, surely you must be the Son of God.
Oh, Robin Williams, you are missed. Surely this man was the Son of God. Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and Salome. In Galilee these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. Just so everyone is aware, that took me about 15 takes to read that right. There was nothing hard to pronounce, for some reason, I couldn't say it. And it was annoying. But that's the end of the death of Jesus in Mark, so now on to Luke. In Luke, we are at chapter 23, verse 44. It was now about the 6th hour, so that agrees with Mark, and darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour, for the sun stopped shining, and the curtain of the temple was torn in 2. Jesus called out with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. When he had said this, he breathed his last. So that doesn't agree with his last words as laid out in Mark, where he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, the apologetic for this is because a couple verses later in Mark, or verse 37, it says, "With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last." So the apologetic for that is that the loud cry that is mentioned in Mark is Luke's, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." I don't quite buy that, but I'll let that slide for now. Verse 47, "The centurion, seeing what had happened, praised God and said, 'Surely this was a righteous man.' When all the people who had gathered to witness this sight saw what took place, they beat their breasts and went away. But all those who knew him, including the woman who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things." So no real serious contradictions here aside from the last words of Jesus, and there is, at this point, I would accept that apologetic as decent, but we'll see later on that it doesn't quite hold up. Okay, so into Matthew. The death of Jesus is in chapter 27, verse 45. "From the 6th hour until the 9th hour, darkness came over all the land. About the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, 'Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani,' which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So that's the same last words that they have in Mark, except there's a little superscript C by Eloi, Eloi, which if I go down to the bottom, it says some manuscripts read Eli, Eli. And the reason for that, I might have some of the details wrong, but if memory serves, the reason for that is because there was a confusion between the Greek that the Gospels were written in and the language that would have been spoken at the time. When they hear him calling out Eloi, that it doesn't make sense that people would think that he was calling to Elijah with Eloi. So the people that were, so Matthew corrected that by changing it to Eli instead of Eloi. And then later scribes corrected Matthew's correction to make it match up with Mark. So verse 47. "When some of those standing there heard this, they said, 'He's calling Elijah.' Immediately one of them ran and got a sponge. He filled it with wine vinegar, put it on a stick, and offered it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, 'Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him.' And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit." So, again, he cried out in a loud voice at this point, so that could be the "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit" from Luke. So I'm not going to contest that quite yet. Verse 51, "At that moment the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks split." So there's an earthquake in this one as well, whereas in Mark and Luke it was just the curtain splitting, but now there's an actual earthquake that's shaking the earth and splitting rocks. And this earthquake has not been recorded by any historian. And there were historians in the area that recorded things like earthquakes. Like there were other earthquakes that were recorded from around the same time by historians, but they were not strong enough earthquakes to have split rocks or anything like that. All right, verse 52. This is one of my favorite verses from the book of Matthew. "The tombs broke open and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs, and after Jesus' resurrection they went into the holy city and appeared to many people. But nobody thought to write down a single word about it except for that one little passage." The Apocalypse according to Matthew. "When the centurion and those who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, 'Surely he was the Son of God.'" Verse 55, "Many women were there watching from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee to care for his needs. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and of Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons." So that's it for the synoptic gospels in Jesus' death story. They mostly line up. There's a couple minor quibbles that you could mention, like, I would think that a major quibble would be a bunch of dead guys getting up and going through Jerusalem and nobody else thought to write about it. Like, that just seems out of place. Like, that's even more important, I would think, than Jesus healing the ear of the guy who got his ear cut off in Gethsemane. Like, Jesus healed his ear, and that's only mentioned in one of the four Gospels. This seems like another one of those events where this is important enough that it should be mentioned multiple times, but there's just two verses about it in all of history. Like an apocalypse, like a zombie apocalypse happens. A bunch of dead guys raised from the graves and invade Jerusalem, and nobody in history mentions it except for this one author for two verses. That's it. That's all we have for this. And this is supposed to be the inerrant perfect word of God? Like, come on. There should be historical documents to back that up. All right, on to John. John's my favorite because his Jesus is just so ridiculous. So we're in chapter 19, verse 28, the death of Jesus. Later, Knowing that all was now completed and so that the scripture would be fulfilled, Jesus said, "I am thirsty." So he already knows everything that's happening, because he is the omniscient, all-powerful God already. He's not a man who is given an elevated status. He is God, so he's giving orders while he's up on the cross. He says, "I am thirsty," and a jar of wine vinegar is there, so they soaked a sponge in it, put the sponge on a stalk of the hyssop plant, and lifted it to Jesus' lips. When he had received the drink, Jesus said, "It is finished." With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. So John's Jesus has the last words, "It is finished," and that's very definitive. This is not, he said it, and then a few hours later he uttered some undetermined cry that, might have been the alternate sentence that was recorded in Luke. But his last words here are, "It is finished," which of course he's still commanding. This is still John's power, Jesus. Verse 31, "Now it was the day of preparation, and the next day was to be a special Sabbath." So this is the day before the Sabbath, and it's the day of preparation for the Passover meal. So they have not yet eaten the Passover like they have in the other Gospels, and it is the day before the Sabbath. So keep that in mind, it will come back. Because the Jews did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath, they asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. The soldiers therefore came and broke the legs of the first man who had been crucified with Jesus, and then those of the other. But when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. Yeah, because you can just say that his testimony is true, and that makes it true without having to verify it at all. And side note, how would you even know that it was blood and water? I mean, most of blood is water, so you mix a bit more water in it. It doesn't look all that different. Like, how would you know that just coming out? He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you also may believe. These things happen so that the scriptures would be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken. And as another scripture says, they will look on the one they have pierced. Now, the first one with that was superscript B. It's Exodus 12:46, which is the instructions for Passover preparation. So John's Jesus is very much the Passover lamb. The other three Gospels didn't have him as, like, he was a symbolic sacrifice, but he wasn't necessarily the Passover lamb. Whereas John's Jesus, he definitely is the Passover lamb. And so it says his scriptures will be fulfilled. Those weren't prophecies. Those were the instructions on how to prepare the Passover lamb. And one of the instructions is don't break any of the bones of its bodies. So this isn't really fulfilling scripture, but, loose interpretation. Fine. Why not? I'll give it to him. So the main contradiction in the death account of Jesus in the Gospels is the description of his last words. So 3 of them kind of agree. 2 of them absolutely agree, no questions whatsoever, with the exception that Matthew was correcting a linguistic mistake made in Mark. But Luke has different last words, but the other 2 do have a line afterwards that could indicate that that's what Jesus said just before he died. So 3 of the Gospels can be said to agree, but John definitely does not. On to the burial. This is where we get to what I think is probably the biggest contradiction in the story. So let's move on. Okay, on to Mark chapter 15, verse 42, the burial of Jesus. This is where we'll start getting into the most important contradiction in this story, and it happens right here at the very first verse, 42. It was the preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath. So Mark agrees that is the day before the Sabbath. John also has it being the day before the Sabbath in chapter 19, verse 31. The next day was to be a special Sabbath. So Mark and John both agree that Jesus was crucified the day before the Sabbath. The difference being, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they've already eaten the Passover meal. So this is the day after Passover that Jesus is crucified. In John, it's the day before the Passover meal that he's crucified. So if they both agree that it's a Sabbath the next day, but they don't agree on whether or not the Passover meal has yet been eaten, not only do the Gospels disagree on what day Jesus was crucified, he can't even have been crucified in the same year in all 4 Gospels. John has him crucified a completely different year from the other 3 Gospels. So biblical inerrancy is out the window at this point. It's just not possible. Continuing on. So as evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, you remember that council that found Jesus unanimously guilty earlier? Not only said all of them that were there found him guilty, it also said that all of them were there. So Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning a centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph bought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in the linen, and placed it in a tomb cut out of rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joseph saw where he was laid. There's a few problems with this. The main one being that they didn't use stones on tombs until around the year 70 CE, which is coincidentally the year that everybody thinks Mark was like that's the earliest date that anybody has for the writing of Mark. So that's a bit of an anachronism in the story. And also, again, what's this Joseph guy doing with his body? Like, why would he spend money on him when he was at the council finding him guilty earlier? And also an interesting little fact, Arimathea, when you translate that out of Greek, it basically turns into best disciple town. That's another one of the bits of evidence that is used to suggest that Mark is complete literary allegory and not actually documenting any events. But on to Luke. So in Luke, we're in chapter 23, verse 50. Now there was a man named Joseph, a member of the council, a good and upright man who had not consented to their decision and action, even though the council was unanimous. He came from the Judean town of Arimathea, that is, Best Discipleville, and he was waiting for the kingdom of God. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body, then he took it down, wrapped it in linen cloth, placed it in a tomb cut in rock, in which no one had yet been laid. It was a preparation day, and the Sabbath was about to begin. So again, this is the day before the Sabbath. All four Gospels agree that it's the day before the Sabbath, which is a huge problem for John, because John has him not only crucified on a different day, but in a completely different year. Verse 55, the woman who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph and saw the tomb, how his body was laid in it. Then they went home and prepared spices and perfumes, but they rested on the Sabbath in obedience to the commandment. So the whole point in having the women there seems just to be that, like, someone was there to see that his body was in the tomb. It's like a magician having a witness come up from the audience to look in the hat to see that there is no rabbit in the hat currently. All right, on to Mark chapter 27, verse 57. As evening approached, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who had himself become a disciple of Jesus. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body, and Pilate ordered that it be given to him. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb that he had cut out of the rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance to the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb. So this is where Matthew has corrected the plot hole that showed up in Mark and Luke, in that Joseph of Arimathea is not a member of the council. He's just an ordinary disciple of Jesus who was following Jesus around. Nothing too exciting going on there. But next we have a section in Matthew that doesn't show up in any of the other Gospels, the guard at the tomb. The next day, the one after the preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. Sir, they said, we remember that while he was still alive, the deceiver said, after 3 days I will rise again. So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise his disciples may come and steal the body and tell people that he had been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first. Take a guard, Pilate answered. Go, make the tomb as secure as you know how. So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard. So that seems to have been added there as just a counter to the objection where, people could say, oh, Jesus rose from the dead. See, it's, Mark, originally at the end, it doesn't have a resurrection. It just has the tomb being empty. So if that's how everything all started, like if Mark was the first gospel and that was the story that was being told at the time, then it's easy to see how people saying, oh, the tomb was empty. Where did his body go? Easy answer to that is, oh, well, his disciples stole the body and said he rose from the dead. So Matthew fixed that by putting a guard at the tomb. So clearly the disciples couldn't have stolen the body because there was a guard at the tomb, even though there's no guard at the tomb in any of the other books. On to John, the burial of Jesus is in chapter 19, verse 38. Later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because he feared the Jews. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, a man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with the spices in strips of linen. This was in accordance with the Jewish burial customs. So this is John fixing some of the errors in the earlier Gospels where they let Jesus' body sit without being tended to with the proper spices for 2 whole days before anyone went there to season the body, let's say. So this has Joseph of Arimathea having the spices and using them, so there's no reason for the women to be going there with spices. Verse 41, at the place where Jesus was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb, in which no one had ever been laid, because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. That makes it seem like they almost just stole the tomb from someone else. Like, oh, here's a tomb that was made for someone else, but you know what? It's the preparation day, it's near where he was crucified, let's just chuck his body in there. So that's it for the burial. Now it's time to get into the interesting things. I might skip some of the resurrection stories for time, because this is getting to be a pretty long series. But we'll move on to Mark and see what Mark has to say about the empty tomb. Okay, so Mark chapter 16 is the resurrection. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go anoint Jesus' body, which, according to John, has already happened before he was buried. Verse 2, very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in white robes sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. This is the young man from the garden that ran away naked. So, if you're reading this as literary allegory, when this man fled and lost his garment, that was symbolizing Jesus losing his life. But now the man is back, so it symbolizes Jesus coming back from the dead. So it's not Jesus, it doesn't specifically say that it's an angel, it just says that it's a young man. So this could be looked at as a literary device to show that Jesus has been risen, without actually showing Jesus in the end, because, as we'll see, the original ending of Mark doesn't really have much about Jesus being risen outside of this literary allegory. It's just this and the guy himself saying that he is risen. Verse 6, don't be alarmed, he said. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And then there's a break in the text, which follows with the words in brackets. The earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have Mark 16 verses 9 through 20. In other words, my Bible itself is admitting that this ending was tacked on later because somebody was unhappy with it just ending with the empty tomb and the women not telling anyone ever. But I'll quickly read the ending of this anyways, it's not too long. Verse 9, when Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had driven 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him and who were mourning and weeping. When they heard that Jesus was alive and that she had seen him, they did not believe it. Afterward, Jesus appeared in a different form to 2 of them while they were walking in the country. These returned and reported it to the rest, but they did not believe them either. Later, Jesus appeared to the 11 as they were eating. He rebuked them for their lack of faith and stubborn refusal to believe those who had seen him after he had risen. He said to them, go into all the world and preach the good news to all creation. Whoever believes, blah, 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 blah. That's just the Great Commission. Go preach to people. Verse 19, after the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was taken up into heaven, and he sat at the right hand of God. Then the disciples went out and preached everywhere, and the Lord worked with them and confirmed his word by the signs that accompanied it. So that ending does not fit with the style of Mark whatsoever. All the biblical scholars know that that was not in the original, that it was tacked on later, but somehow it made it into the canonized version of the Bible. Keep in mind that this doesn't exactly match up with the order of appearances that it shows in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 5 through 8, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. That list does not jive up at all with this, where he appears first to Mary Magdalene, then he appeared in different form to 2 of them, which doesn't specify who those 2 are, but the assumption would be that they're 2 disciples. Later, Jesus appeared to the 11, so this is the 11 disciples. They haven't replaced Judas yet. That's where in the last part I took issue with Corinthians saying that he appeared to the 12 and saying that the 12 may have referred to the Council of 12, because like in Mark it specifically says he appeared to the 11, so the 11 is not the 12. And then after he gives them his Great Commission where, go preach to everybody and also let snakes bite you and you won't die. That sort of thing. Now, that's where the snake handlers get it from. So after he says that, he goes straight to heaven right after that. Like, he only appears to Mary Magdalene, 2 guys on the road that might not be disciples but probably are, and then the 11, and then he disappears. Nothing about 500, nothing about Paul. I mean, Paul's was a self-admitted vision rather than a physical apparition, so that makes sense. But it doesn't jive with the rest. Anyway. On to Luke. Okay, I'm running out of time for this one, so I'm not going to read the rest of the resurrection accounts, but suffice it to say there are numerous contradictions. For instance, none of the Gospels mention the 500 witnesses that Paul mentions having seen Jesus risen. They all seem to disagree about how long Jesus was back before he ascended into heaven. Like that ending from Mark, we saw he basically is just the day that he resurrected. He hung out with his disciples for a bit and then floated up into heaven. John has him on earth for a couple weeks, maybe. Matthew and Luke, sometime in between that. Like, he does more than he did in Mark, but he does less than he did in John. In the book of Acts, it says he appeared to them for a period of 40 days. That's Acts chapter 1, verse 3. Acts was probably written by the same guy who wrote Luke. If you follow the timeline in Luke, Luke does have him ascending on the same day as his resurrection. So, according to the same author, he both ascended on the same day that he was resurrected, and he stuck around for 40 days after. There's also the contradiction about who was at the tomb, which women were there, which man was there. That's Book of John has Peter and the disciple Jesus loved having continuing their pissing contest where Peter and the disciple who Jesus loved are both running to the tomb, but the disciple who Jesus loved outran Peter and got there first, because, he's John. John's probably the most fun. I highly recommend reading John just for the comedic value alone. It's amazing. But anyway, I would like to encourage you to pick it up and read it for yourself. I'm sure there are things that I've gotten wrong on this. There are interpretations that I've overlooked. There are apologetics that I've probably overlooked. So read it for yourself. Again, I'd like to restate my opinion that if the all-powerful and all-knowing creator of the universe wants you to read a specific book and wants you to get a specific message out of this specific book, he can do it in a way that's not ambiguous. Would it take away our free will for him to write the book in a plain-as-day way that anyone can interpret it correctly for themselves without having to study for years to become a theologian? I don't think so. And so I think a plain reading of it, if you can see this many contradictions and this many problems, it's obvious from reading them back to back like this, these books were written for different denominations. They were writing for different audiences. They're explaining why the other books aren't quite right. Especially John. John often blatantly contradicts them. He doesn't just passively contradict them like, oh yeah, Jesus carried his cross out to Golgotha. It's like, oh, those other 3 gospels have him being helped. He carried his own cross because he's God. Like, he comes out and is so blatant about the contradiction. It's so clear that he's writing for an audience that was confused by these other gospel accounts that were out there. So they wrote their account, and this is the one that we follow. That's like, it's early church doctrine, basically. But that's it for my Easter video. I hope you've enjoyed it. Next week, I'm thinking of looking at Kent Hovind video that he put up just after his debate with Aaron Ra. He supposedly, in the title, he says he's defining what a kind is. I've watched a bit of it. I haven't watched the whole thing. It doesn't look like he's going to define what a kind is. It looks like it'll be pretty fun to take apart. So I'll be back to my usual shtick next week. See you then. In the meantime, feel free to follow me on Twitter or Facebook or support me on Patreon. See you next time.